Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast that celebrates trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstiss, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. I'm delighted to say that this, the 13th season of the podcast, is a serialisation of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. Chapter 4, Full Coverage. Sport is home to one of the most intense and most historically enduring gender divisions in journalism, in terms of who is permitted to cover which sports as journalists, how athletes are covered, as well as in terms of which genders are served as audiences. Deborah Chambers, Women in Journalism, 2004. Throughout the day, as we have already noted, every TV and radio news bulletin ends with a sporting roundup. The back pages of every newspaper feature sport. Conversations at work revolve around the weekend's games. Mass events unite us as families, communities and nations as we gather around TV screens. Sport provides a unique platform to reach and influence people of all ages on a global scale. Yet women feature so rarely in the media coverage. Professor Tony Bruce, an expert in the field of gender and sport, explains that within society we are literally enveloped in media sport. Any sport not experienced in the space where it happens, but represented through the media. In our global, corporate, sporting world, this makes media sport almost inescapable, reaching millions, if not billions, of people. And because this coverage of sport sits within the news media, audiences naturally associate it with objectivity and balance. They believe the way in which sport is shown is a truthful reflection of society. Media sport is not an innocent player in society. The ideologies, attitudes and values that are present in media sport production powerfully shape our understanding of ourselves and others, explains Professor Bruce. It seems remarkable that it was just a decade ago, in 2011, that the BBC Sports Personality of the Year panel selected an all-male shortlist of 10 contenders, and no one on the panel thought that this might be an issue. Even more shocking was the fact that Lads Mags, Nuts and Zoo were included on the judging panel that year. Neither of them put forward a single female to be in contention for the shortlist. Even in 2020, only one woman, record-breaking jockey Holly Doyle, made the shortlist of 6. Much reference research from Women in Sport back in 2010 showed that less than 5% of sports coverage in the media included women. Not a lot has changed since then, and it's the same the world over. Professor Mary Jo Kane, the founder of the US Tucker Center for Research on Women and Girls in Sport, says that in the course of 40 to 50 years of research and hundreds of studies about the representation of women's sport, the results have been amazingly consistent. Only 4 to 6% of the whole landscape, be that print, broadcast, online or social media, is given over to women's sport. She points out that this gives a false representation of women taking part in sport at all levels. Despite dramatic increases in women participating in sport at all levels globally, averages are 10% in print media coverage and 5% in broadcast media. A damning indictment of the institutionalised sexism of sports reporting is how Graham Turner described the situation in 1997. Not much has changed since then. An ongoing study in the US that tracks the amount of TV coverage for women's sport since 1989 shows that it has continued to hover around 2% for the past decade. In 2013, it fell to an all-time low of 1.6%. In 2015, it reached the grand heights of 3.2%. I try to make it a habit to count the number of female sports stories on the major sports channels, including BBC, Sky and BT Sport. On a particularly bad day, Perhaps just 2 or 3 stories of the 70 featured on either homepage or app would include women's sport. The BBC recognised its previous poor performance in terms of the coverage of women's sport and in 2019 launched its #ChangeTheGame campaign with the goal of providing unprecedented levels of women's sport coverage across the summer. At many points in the following months, the balance of coverage on the BBC's homepage took a huge shift to approach a 50% share for women's sports stories. I commented on Twitter at the time that it felt as if we'd moved into a wonderful parallel universe where parity of women's sports coverage was the norm for a few weeks. This increase in coverage was certainly helped by a summer of major women's sports events, including the FIFA Women's World Cup, the Golfing Solheim Cup, the Netball World Cup, and the Women's Ashes, which provided the BBC and other sports channels with great content and an engaged audience. Sadly, it would appear that #ChangeTheGame did not transform the coverage long term, and those fantastic levels of coverage on the BBC channels were not maintained in the 6 months that followed the busy summer. Women's sports stories returned to the levels of 10 to 15% in the autumn of 2019. Some positive news, at least, as this was higher than they had been before the summer, and still more than the 4% average of Sky Sports and even less for BT Sport. It was the same in print media, as Claire Balding pointed out to me. 2019 was always going to be a massive year because it's not an Olympic year and there wasn't a Men's Football World Cup to compete with. The combination of the Women's Football World Cup and the Netball World Cup happening so close together and virtually overlapping, with Wimbledon being right there in the middle as well. This meant women's sport was going to be at a level of exposure it had never been at before. But you know what? As soon as the Premier League season started again, you would open a newspaper and go, well, the women clearly aren't doing anything today. And again, not on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Oh, there's a tiny little 2 lines there about Charlotte Dujardin being eliminated at the European Championships. And I just think, come on, guys. There's so much written that's not really news, but just creates a noise around male sport. The BBC is certainly much better in its coverage of women's sport than, say, 10 years ago, largely driven by Barbara Slater, who became the BBC's first female director of sport in April 2009. A former gymnast, who represented Great Britain in the 1976 Olympic Games in Montreal, she carried our flag at the opening ceremony. Barbara has been outspoken about the BBC's need to do better. On the decision to show more archives of sporting events when there was no live sport in the spring of 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, she reflected, I think, amongst that archive there probably is an element of truth that our output, in the past, was dominated by men. But we will be making sure we celebrate women's achievements just as much. The broadcaster has an enormous role to play in making sport visible, but it needs the buy-in of multiple stakeholders. It needs sponsors, governing bodies, the written press, and the competitors themselves. We could not have delivered the audiences last summer, 2019, had it not had that collective will from across the industry. I don't think any one element can do this on its own. It requires investment from governing bodies. It requires much wider cultural changes of attitude. If you look at the quality of the coverage of the Women's World Cup, it was multi-camera, it was covered like a main event, and it was broadcast like a main event. A concern of mine has always been that, although you might have fantastic leadership from the top of the BBC Sports Department, from Barbara Slater, and the women's sports leads like Anna Thompson and Vix Cotton, does this fully filter through the entire organisation? What's the attitude of the digital team as they upload the latest stories that they judge will appeal to sports fans? Sadly, I think many in these roles naturally revert to what they know, not viewing the potential stories through the lens of equality. A simple example of this that I remember vividly came during the Rio Olympics in 2016, when Britain won its first Olympic medal in the women's 4x100 metre relay for 32 years. You would have understandably expected this to be the lead story on the BBC website that afternoon. But frustratingly, until some prompting ensured it was rightly updated, it wasn't the extraordinary Asher Phillip, Dean Asher-Smith, Daryl Neater and Desiree Henry who topped the BBC Sports News page that day, but the fact that Adam Jamili had placed 4th in the men's 100 metres. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of Adam Jamili, but at the time it really struck me that someone in the BBC team clearly decided that his 4th place was a more significant achievement than the women's record-breaking medal-winning performance. I'd encourage others to call out this bias and inequality when they see it. We all need to make more noise to remind the media that coverage like this is simply unacceptable. When it's high-profile individuals making the point, that's even better. In 2015, Andy Murray was shocked to see the placement of the story about Katarina Johnson-Thompson's gold medal in the pentathlon at the European World Indoor Championships on the BBC homepage. Why is Johnson-Thompson's gold medal story headline number 22 on the BBC Sport homepage right now? Complete joke, he tweeted. Go Andy. The UK's print media is no different. In the last decade, you could often read the sports pages of a broadsheet or tabloid newspaper and not find a single article or mention of women's sport. Not one. A sports quiz this weekend, in Saturday's Times for instance, had only 2 questions out of 25 that even mentioned women's sport. I don't understand how, in 2021, when someone had created the quiz and it had then been edited, laid out and proofed, no one thought that the quiz looked a little imbalanced. Reasons for the lack of female coverage vary, but the main excuse has been that there's just not an audience for women's sport. Websites and newspapers research what their customers want, and funnily enough, it turns out they think they all want Premiership football, along with men's rugby, cricket and boxing. But is this really the case, or is it more a matter that sports media is predominantly run by men who naturally revert to writing about what they know, men's sport? Researchers refer to this as the gatekeeping theory, which helps us to understand who makes up the media and how those decision makers shape what gets covered. According to data on Associated Press sports editors in 2016, less than 10% of sports editors or assistant sports editors were women, and women also make up a minority of reporters, 12.6%, and columnists, 12.4%. A report from the Women's Media Centre in 2017 found that 89% of sports coverage in the US was written by men. Obviously, a huge majority of the gatekeepers are men, and of those men, almost all are white. The gatekeeping occurs at many different stages, from selecting what gets covered to producing and editing content and then deciding what is published or transmitted. When an editor claims no one is interested in women's sport and fewer resources are dedicated to covering women's sport, this is gatekeeping. Professor Mary Jo Kane, who has done vast amounts of research in this space, is clear in her opinion that when a sports editor claims no one is interested, it really means he is not interested. Along with gatekeeping, another key consideration is the way in which women's sport is framed for the audience. Sports coverage often minimises the competence of female athletes and highlights their feminine traits, their sexuality or traditional gender stereotypes. They are also often infantilised by commentators with reference to the girls or ladies. If we look back at the history of the sporting media, you could understandably feel that things have not changed significantly since the first sports pages emerged in the 19th century. Sports journalism effectively began with specialised magazines for sports such as horse racing and boxing, in the 1820s, before newspapers became affordable and accessible to all, along with rising literacy rates. In the US, yellow journalism saw publishers looking for the most sensational stories that would appeal to the masses and sell copies. A very similar approach was taken by our own tabloid press and red tops. Sport was ideal for this. In the UK, Saturday sports papers were hugely popular in reporting men's sport. The local newspaper, published on a Saturday evening soon after that afternoon's games finished, contained information about the sports played that day. A different paper, the Sports Pink or Green 'Un, was produced in each area covering local teams in depth. As newspapers grew, they saw that they needed a distinct sports section. And in the US, by 1920, every major paper had a sports section, often taking up nearly 20% of the space. The journalists were men, and they primarily wrote about men's sport for male readers. Sports journalists were hugely powerful at this time, as newspapers provided sports fans with the only real opportunity to find out about their team's performance. Despite many attempts to create print media outlets dedicated to women's sport over the years, the majority haven't survived. In the US, these have included Sportswoman, Billie Jean King's Women Sports, which became the Women's Sports Foundation's Women's Sports, and then Condé Nast's Women's Sport and Fitness, Real Sports, which was published for 5 years, and Sports Illustrated for Women, SI Women, which ran for just 20 issues. Closer to home in the UK, there was the magnificent Sports Sister, created by Danielle Selwood and Louise Hudson, which I still believe was very much ahead of its time. With coverage of women's sport growing in the past decade, it appears that new media is succeeding where traditional print did not. Well-respected websites, podcasts, and collectives dedicated to women's sport are generating large followings, often created in direct response to the lack of coverage in traditional print and broadcast media. Newswires and digital channels for women's sport have emerged, including the likes of ESPNW and Give Me Sport Women. Siren in Australia is a collective of women's sports advocates, content creators and fans who want more from mainstream coverage of women in sport. Its website and newsletters deliver feminist content that challenges the status quo of sport media. If you're a fan of women's rugby, the Scrum Queens website has long been a much-admired voice for women's rugby union, with podcasts such as Women's Rugby Pod and Tryhards growing in popularity and reach. If you want to know more about the Women's Super League or have a passion for women's football, download the FA Player app, watch Sky's Women's Football Show, or listen to TalkSport's Women's Football Weekly podcast or the Offside Rule WSL edition. For something more informal, there's Two Girls Talk Balls or the Players podcast. If your passion is cricket, there's No Balls, the cricket podcast, or Women's Cricket Chat. And if women's basketball is more your thing, you could follow the WNBA via Swish Appeal, High Post Hoops, or WNBA Nation. For more general women's sports coverage, there's now plenty of podcast choice, including Women Who Sport, Just Women's Sports, Fired Up Sport, Her Spirit, In Her Corner, Burn It All Down, and, if it's not too self-indulgent to mention it here, my own podcast, The Game Changers, which features interviews with trailblazing women in sport. The new channel, ESPNW, had a clear ambition to change the conversation around women's sport when it launched in 2010. The global, multi-platform brand sits across digital, television, radio, film, events, educational platforms and social media, and is dedicated to engaging and inspiring women through sports. It continues to see massive growth as sports fans of all genders use new media to watch games, gain insights about their favourite players and teams, and join communities and forums. It's not solely new media, though. As mentioned in my 12 game-changing moments, in 2018 The Telegraph launched Telegraph Women's Sport. In describing the launch, editor Anna Kessel said, "As the United Nations puts it, sport has the power to unlock gender equality for women and girls around the world. I am proud that The Telegraph is leading this historic step to contribute towards that drive for change. When I asked Anna more about the section's manifesto, she said the aim was to have unprecedented coverage of women's sport, which, to be fair, was starting from a very low baseline of 2% newspaper sports coverage dedicated to women. I don't know what the stats are now, but it's rocketed. Anna explained that they now have an entire department. There's me and Vicky Hodges, the deputy. We've got 3 full-time women's writers, football, then across sports. We've also got a rugby writer who splits her time between men's and women's rugby. We've got a cricket writer who splits her time between men's cricket and women's cricket. And then right across the paper, athletics, cycling, everybody is doing both men's and women's sport, which is really, really exciting. In a further boost for their women's sports coverage, The Telegraph makes it freely available to all, unlike the rest of the newspaper, which now sits behind a paywall. Whilst I applaud both ESPNW and Telegraph Women's Sport, and also The Times for appointing Rebecca Myers to specialise in women's sport, there's a danger if women's sport becomes siloed away from the main sports section and therefore doesn't receive exposure to general sports fans. Editors may feel they have done their bit for women's sport with dedicated sections or writers, and therefore do not need to ensure there's gender balance across the mainstream coverage. Sky Sports also announced some bold plans to increase its commitment to women's sport in 2020 by expanding its existing coverage and strengthening its digital output, building on the fantastic work it had done in recent years across women's cricket, rugby, football and netball. The station announced that live women's sport would be showcased to brand new audiences via Sky Sports' YouTube channel, with events such as the Women's Six Nations, WNBA, Vitality Netball Super League and Women's Cricket among those to be made freely available for any viewers. It was also predicted in the British media that Sky Sports would be the new broadcast partner for the FA Women's Super League from 2021, as they swooped in with a landmark offer to take all coverage of the top tier from BT Sport. Rumours of this deal came a few weeks after the WSL agreed a US rights deal with NBC, the American broadcaster, which is also owned by Sky's parent company Comcast. Sky have also been a very supportive partner to leading women's sports organisations such as the Women's Sport Trust and the Women's Sport Collective, the network for women working in sport, which I co-founded with Kate Hannon in 2020. As we've seen with the BBC, though, the positive message at the top doesn't always seem to filter across the entire organisation. For all the magnificent work Sky are doing in some areas, they have then let themselves down in the past by broadcasting promotional videos with a compilation of sports or events that don't include any women, beyond those cheering in the crowd of a men's game. Or, in another example, an enormous Sky Sports advertising hoarding on the side of a building on the A4, heading into London, that only featured male sports stars. Hopefully, this is becoming a thing of the past as attitudes change throughout the organisation and they work to maximise their formidable female sports rights. The demand to watch women's sport is growing, especially around big global events. In 2019, a combined audience of 1.2 billion tuned in to watch coverage of the FIFA Women's World Cup across all platforms, a record for the event. The final attracted an average audience of 82.2 million TV viewers, a significant 56% increase over the 52.5 million that watched the US women beat Japan in 2015. The semi-final, which saw the Lionesses lose 2-1 to the US team, attracted a UK TV audience of 11.7 million, making it one of the most watched TV programmes of the entire year, beaten by a nation's favourite, Gavin and Stacey, on Christmas Day. A total audience of 28.1 million, 47% of the UK population watched some of the BBC's coverage of the tournament. FIFA President Gianni Infantino commented on the cultural phenomenon of the FIFA World Cup, that has the power to attract media attention and provide a platform for women's football to flourish. The fact that we broke the 1 billion target just shows the pulling power of the women's game and the fact that if we promote and broadcast world-class football widely, whether it's played by men or women, the fans will always want to watch. It's such a key point. If women's sport is promoted and broadcast, then people will watch it. Ahead of the 2019 Women's World Cup, the national bodies worked hard to ensure we got to know the English and Scottish players, giving us a reason to care about them and want to follow their success. With dedicated TV documentaries, newspaper and magazine features and social media takeovers, the players' profiles were promoted and the public bought into their stories. Other major women's sports events that have attracted great viewing figures when promoted well include the final of the Women's Rugby World Cup in 2017. A thrilling but heartbreaking game for the Red Roses fans saw the Black Ferns beat reigning champions England in front of a TV audience of 2.6 million. One of my most powerful memories of watching women's sport happened along with over 9 million other viewers when the GB women's hockey team won gold at the Rio Olympics in 2016. And where women's sport has always had equal billing to the men's, there's little disparity in the viewing figures. An incredible 16.3 million of us tuned in to watch Jess Ennis-Hill win heptathlon gold at London 2012, with 17.1 million watching Mo Farah win the 10,000 metres later that same night. In recent years, both the US Open and Wimbledon have, on occasion, seen the women's finals attracting more viewers than the men's, and research from leading data analysis firm Nielsen showed that approximately 14.3 million US viewers tuned in to watch the 2019 Women's World Cup final on TV, compared to 11.4 million for the 2018 Men's World Cup final, a 22% increase in viewers. Other women's sports showing massive growth in viewership include basketball, with the WNBA reporting record increases in 2019. Its 2020 draft, where teams select new players for the next season, was held virtually because of COVID-19 and broadcast on ESPN and became the most watched WNBA draft in 16 years, up 123% over the 2019 draft. More good news from the National Women's Soccer League, where viewership was up 493% in 2020 following a new partnership with CBS and Twitch. The league also recorded its 7 most watched games ever, including a record 653,000 viewers of the NWSL Challenge Cup Championship. Commenting on the dramatic improvements, Commissioner Lisa Baird told Insider that in the past, the NWSL had only been available on cable networks, limiting fans' ability to access the games. She believes the switch to network television contributed significantly to the league's huge rating spikes in 2020. The numbers you're seeing are truly the increase, but last year, most of our games were on cable, Baird said. The comparison is broadcast to cable, so let's just be very upfront about that. That is one of the major reasons we had such tremendous growth. The article goes on to point out that for years in the US there has been an assumption that the audience just isn't there for women's sports. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, leaving leagues like the NWSL and the WNBA with no real platform to share their product. It looks like things might have changed at last in 2020, as, along with the NWSL deal with CBS, the WNBA agreed an extensive schedule of games which were broadcast on ESPN, ESPN2 and ABC in the summer. It was ESPN's largest WNBA schedule ever and included 37 live regular season games, playoffs and the whole 2020 finals. We and the WNBA deserve to be proud of women's sports and what we've done, Baird said. It's just having that platform to tell the stories. We worked really closely with CBS. They were pretty bullish on women's soccer and said, yeah, we're going to give you an enormous platform. And we were able to carry that audience that we developed and bring it in to show people great games. Similar bold moves are taking place for women's sport across Europe. In November 2020, the Dutch public service broadcaster, NOS, agreed to a deal for the TV and radio rights to all matches played by the national women's team, the reigning European champions. The broadcaster's extensive female football portfolio already includes the delayed Tokyo Olympics, the UEFA Women's Championship, and shared coverage of the top-level domestic league. Why the increased investment? In 2017, the Women's Euros were a massive draw for NOS, with 4.1 million people tuning in to watch the Dutch national team win the final. It took 83% of the TV market share. In Australia, coverage of women's cricket has grown from a 1-hour highlights package 15 years ago to 130 hours of live, free-to-air coverage in 2019-2020. This included 36 of the Women's Big Bash League games and all Australian international games. The league has grown to be the fourth highest viewed league in Australia, male or female, recording over 300,000 viewers several times in the 2020 season, 30% up on the previous year. So, we will watch women's sport when it's available, but sadly, so much of this fantastic content is just not available for audiences to see. When it's hard to find on obscure channels or streamed on websites, it's only the really dedicated fans who are going to gather around a laptop or iPad to watch some poor quality broadcast of a sport they love. This was highlighted in my own home this weekend. We'd watched some fantastic men's Premiership rugby coverage on Friday night. Despite the lack of any crowds because of COVID, the broadcast included superb multiple camera angles and editing, knowledgeable commentators, witty former players as pundits, plentiful game stats, and fascinating interviews with players and staff. The next day saw me attempting to watch the only women's Premier 15s game being broadcast this week. It was a superb, exciting battle that saw Susie Appleby's newly formed Exeter Chiefs beating 2 times Premier 15s champion Saracens women 22-14, and in the process halting their 33-match unbeaten run. Both teams played exceptionally well in a hugely entertaining game. What a disappointment then, to have to watch the game on a dodgy live stream from England Rugby. Limited cameras meant there were a few close-ups of the action, commentary could have been better, and technical issues resulted in there being no sound at all in places. Hardly the way to convince new viewers to the Premier 15s that women's rugby is worth watching. It's the same the world over. Talking to Jessica Luther for the book Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, written with Kavitha Davidson, WNBA player Imani McGee-Stafford said, "The truth of the matter is that today, right now, fans have to do a lot of homework just to be fans. I always say that we just have the best fans in the world because they literally have to go on a scavenger hunt to be our fans." The accessibility of coverage is also a consideration. While there might be hundreds of hours of women's sport being broadcast via the Red Button, YouTube channels and sites like the FA Player, getting the women's product on free-to-air, mainstream TV and radio is surely essential if women's sport is ever going to be accepted as equal to men's by the mass market. Free-to-air media, like the BBC, ITV and Channel 4, is where women's sport will pick up new sports fans who are interested in all sport, along with those who only tune in for the major events. Fortunately, most of the major women's sports events are now better covered than ever before. We saw this in the summer of 2019 when the FIFA Women's World Cup and the Netball World Cup were broadcast in their entirety on the BBC, including qualifying rounds and all nations. And when women's live sport resumed at the end of the summer during the 2020 pandemic, it was great to see the BBC, Sky and BT Sport collaborating to ensure coverage of women's football and cricket was freely available for everyone to see. Similarly, it was such a positive move when the BBC broadcast 2 England women's rugby matches against France in November 2020. This was the first time women's rugby had been shown live on the BBC, but it had taken much work at the RFU to make it happen, investing in the production at a very challenging time for the sport. Hopefully, the success of this content will demonstrate the potential audience for women's rugby and more games will be broadcast in the future. Outside of the major events, where women's sport has fallen down in the past is the lack of week-to-week coverage. Kelly Simmons, Director of the Women's Professional Game at the Football Association, explains, "I think we've cracked pinnacle events in women's sport, Olympics, World Cups. Whatever the sport, big moments, big audiences, big profile. But what we haven't cracked, what we are starting to crack with the Barclays FAWSL, is that regular coverage. So the sport doesn't disappear until the next 2-year or 4-year big major event. That real breakthrough into mainstream, and I think with the WSL we can really do that. And if we can be the breakthrough sport for women, that is hugely powerful for women and girls in wider society. It's bigger than football." In Women in Sports, Where Did All the Women Go? Report in 2018, the charity also highlighted that the success of national female teams has been an important driver of media coverage, often filling a void when our men's national teams have performed less well. The authors then raised the question of how women's sport can remain visible in the media regardless of success in the future. Despite recent high-profile wins at major championships in hockey, cricket and netball, will we keep seeing more highs and lows in coverage in the future? The report went on to recognise that, along with the team's success, the decision to give women's sport significant coverage was often due to the persistence of individual journalists and media outlets. Coverage often relies on having strong allies within media organisations. So how can sports support these individual journalists in the future with great content and access to players? Finally, the report recognised that better scheduling of events can also create more opportunities. This is something that the FA has been particularly good at, working with the men's game and actively targeting the gaps in the football calendar. The quality of the coverage itself can also be a huge issue. A sports broadcast that includes a wide variety of camera angles and great editing can be a joy to watch, versus a match covered with a couple of static cameras. I'll confess that I've never been a massive cricket fan. It wasn't a sport I watched much growing up, and I've never seen the attraction of following an event that could last for days, played at what I felt was an incredibly slow pace. But watching the coverage of the Women's T20 World Championships from Australia in 2019 was a revelation. With multiple angles, close-up coverage, views of every player, clever visual analysis, witty, knowledgeable commentary, it was fascinating. I found myself completely drawn into the exciting games and began regularly tuning in so I didn't miss a match as England progressed through the rounds, until sadly missing out on a place in the finals because of rain. As I watched, it dawned on me that a big part of the attraction for me on this occasion was the superb visual and audio coverage. For much of women's team sports, there just isn't the budget required to provide that quality of coverage with amazing close-ups and replays. Critics of women's sport will always suggest that the imbalance of media coverage is just a result of what's popular and what's not. If people were interested in women's cricket or rugby or football in the way they are men's, it would be allocated comparable coverage. It brings us back to the chicken and egg scenario, where eminent gender studies scholar Professor Cheryl Cookie suggests that most of our perceptions about women's sport are attributable to the media coverage we see. Men's sport will always be seen as more enthralling than women's when it has higher production values with more cameras, replays and close-ups, professional commentary and halftime analysis, on-screen graphics and pre-game build-up with engaging backstories of players and teams. How can women's sport ever compete? With limited camera angles, less professional commentary and fewer players' backstories, the coverage will never be as engaging to watch, which in turn means it won't attract the same size audience. Investment in high-quality production will make an enormous difference to the perception of women's sport and the viewing figures. Congratulations to the broadcasters, sponsors and rights holders who are committed to investing in this area to ensure women's sport is seen in all its glory. Another issue that appears to result in less printed media coverage for female sport is that, along with the lack of women working as sports journalists, there's an assumption that female journalists will be the only ones reporting on women's sport. This belief that women write only for women is something that dates right back to the early years of newspapers, when editors saw the need to recruit female writers but confined their reporting to fashion and society news. A new kind of women's journalism evolved, with female journalists only writing stories which would appeal to women readers. Other topics, including sport of course, remain covered by men for men to read. Many researchers, over the years, have exposed the fact that sports media is mainly written by men, for men, about men. But having male allies call out the sexism in sports coverage can also drive significant change. David Stern, the commissioner of the NBA, was renowned for supporting the WNBA against what he thought were media attacks or an indefensible lack of interest, attending events like the Associated Press Sports Editors Convention, where he would invariably get into arguments. "We felt the WNBA didn't get the respect that we thought it deserved," Stern said. "The way editors decided on what to cover was, they said, part art and part science. I always used to tweak them. I'd say, that sounds like excuses, and I'd remind them that's the way the old boy network always cut down on minorities and women getting jobs." Another fascinating dilemma when it comes to building an audience for women's sport is who should the media be targeting? Writing about ESPNW, the world's leading portal for women's sport, Anya Alvarez, a former golf professional and contributing writer, says only 28% of ESPNW's audience is female, according to a 2017 ComScore report. Whilst it was created with the intention of serving a female readership, it continues to struggle to connect with them. Why? Because they're targeting the wrong audience. Trying to reach women who don't play sports and who weren't given equal opportunity to play sports growing up is a misguided strategy. Before Title IX, 1 in 27 girls played sports. Now, 2 of 5 girls play sports. That means close to 20 million girls in the United States under the age of 18 are active athletes. That is your market, not the women who didn't play sports growing up. Get those 20 million girls to women's sports events and you'll have an audience who will become lifelong fans, because loyalty to a sports team is about engendering a connection early on. Stats from Nielsen show there is a latent demand for more women's sports coverage from both men and women. Their 2018 research across 8 key markets around the world, US, UK, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Australia and New Zealand, found that 84% of sports fans are interested in women's sport. Of those, 51% are male, which confirms it's not just women who are interested in watching women's sport. There's a gender-balanced audience for it, with a major opportunity to engage male fans too. Perhaps surprisingly, it's men who make up the majority of fans for the Women's Tennis Association, the Ladies Professional Golf Association, and the WNBA. A third of all US Major League sports fans, for the likes of the NFL, Major League Baseball and the NBA, are women, with 47% of Australian sports fans now female, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It's clearly not a binary matter of men supporting men's sports and women supporting women's sports, as many people assume. Digital presents a fantastic opportunity for women's sport as we witness a shift away from linear TV coverage and print media as the main route to consumption. While the survival of men's sport often depends on broadcast revenue, that's not been the case for the women, which might now be an advantage. women's sport has the opportunity to pivot its offering, to be more creative in the ways it serves its growing audience as, unlike traditional media, digital time and space are unlimited and, in effect, free. The growth of social media also provides the potential to move away from traditionally male-biased mainstream media, growing fan communities and raising the profile of women's sport. Individuals can become journalists themselves with blogs, websites, podcasts and YouTube channels, joining forces to promote their favourite athletes and teams. The entry of platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Netflix, Twitch and Prime could also be great news for women's sport as they help drive ticket sales and merchandise, building new audiences and marketing athletes to current and new fans. In 2020, Amazon's live streaming platform, Twitch, announced a 3-year deal to show US National Women's Soccer League games. As part of the deal, Twitch has the exclusive rights to live stream NWSL games outside the US, showing all 108 regular season games, the playoffs and championship to viewers worldwide. Twitch is also collaborating with the NWSL to create additional content from the league and its players. For those of you who might not know, Twitch pioneered the idea of live streaming people playing video games and understandably has a very young male audience. Sports programming enables a platform to diversify and appeal to a broad audience and presents a fantastic opportunity for women's sport. Watch this space. While many sports undoubtedly need to do more to understand how they can use digital to drive the commercial value of women's sports, some organisations are already embracing this change. For the 2019-2020 season, the Football Association launched the FA Player, its live streaming platform dedicated to women's football. Free to use and available online and via an app, the FA Player provides live access to all Barclays FAWSL matches, a live match from each round of the Women's Championship, archive Lionesses footage, and interactive, engaging content from the players. It quickly reached over 100,000 subscribers. Commenting at the time of the launch, the FA's Kelly Simmons said, "This announcement is a pivotal and significant step in the FA's journey to grow the women's game and attract new audiences. We know people want to watch football in different ways, with content that's quickly and easily accessible." Anecdotal reporting indicates that it's often stories about women's sport that get the biggest pickup on social media. The most viewed clip on the ECB's Facebook page in 2019 was a catch by Fran Wilson. And, at the time of writing, the Rugby Football League's most watched video in 2020 was an incredible tackle by Kelsey Gentles. Audiences are interested in female athletes, and these numbers will grow further if they're given access to high-quality content. There's a young, engaged fan base on digital, and it's now down to the rights holders and sports bodies to package the women's product and deliver it in a way that appeals, investing in top-quality production and distribution. As Chris Hurst, a fellow trustee on the Women's Sport Trust Board and leading digital sports consultant, told me, digital platforms present an excellent way for sports stakeholders, be they governing bodies, media or brands, to use their platforms to tell the stories that may not have gained mainstream media exposure previously. They also allow stories to be told in a very targeted and personalised way to different audiences. UEFA's #WePlayStrong campaign is a great example of this, making sport more accessible to a female audience and driving greater interest in women's sport overall. I would expect that during the next decade, gender parity of coverage on a governing body's own social media accounts will become a greater area of focus. The rise of branded digital content delivered in partnership with sponsors who want their brands to be associated with both the men's and women's teams will be a major driver of this change. I also think that the rise of sports OTT platforms, over the top, where content is streamed directly to consumers, allowing governing bodies and leagues to go direct to the consumer as part of a well-structured broadcast rights package with a mix of free-to-air, pay TV and short-form digital clip rights, that can be syndicated to third-party platforms will be a real area of evolution. It will help industry leaders better understand the audience consuming women's sport and what content they want to see more of. I wouldn't want success in the digital space to mean that women's sport gets overlooked in more traditional sports broadcasting. There's no doubt that linear, free-to-watch television is essential if women's sport is to reach a new audience, but it's certainly an area where women's sport has an opportunity to thrive, especially, as Chris suggests, when it's part of a well-structured, integrated package. Thank you so much for listening to the serialisation of my book Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. If you'd like a copy, it's available in hardback and paperback in all good bookshops and online. The Game Changers podcast is free to listen to on all podcast platforms. Head over to fearlesswomen.co.uk to find out more about all of the incredible game changers I've spoken to in previous series. There are over 100 of them, including elite athletes, journalists, coaches, scientists, broadcasters and CEOs. As well as listening to all the episodes on the website, you can find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive network for all women working in sport. And you can register for the Fearless Women newsletter, a weekly review of the global developments in women's sport. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter at Sue Anstiss. Finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd be so grateful if you could do two things. Firstly, if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd really appreciate it. And secondly, if there's anyone in your life, at home or at work, who you think might enjoy the podcast, please do let them know about it and help us spread the word about women's sport and the stories of these incredible game changers.